Sarah Miller stood in the blistering Montana heat, listening to the sound of her father's legacy being torn apart. The auctioneer's gavel sounded like a bone snapping. The bankers were already smiling, ready to swallow the Morning Star Ranch whole. But then, a dusty stranger stepped out of the shadows. He didn't have a bag of gold. He had a single worn copper coin, and with that 1 cent he did something that silenced the entire valley and stopped the law in its tracks. What secret was hidden in that piece of copper? And why would a man risk his life for a woman who didn't even know his name? Welcome to our channel, where we breathe life into the dusty trails of the American West. Here, we share stories of rugged cowboys, enduring love, the unbreakable bond of family, and the quiet power of human compassion. This story reminds us that the true value of a home isn't measured in dollars, but in the blood and sacrifices of those who defended it. It's a lesson in how a single act of selfless gratitude can outbid the greed of the entire world. If this story touched your heart, please tip your hat to us by hitting the like button. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your own stories of hope.
The gavel didn't sound like wood hitting wood. To Sarah Miller, standing in the blistering Montana heat, it sounded like a bone snapping. It was the sound of a legacy breaking in half. The yard of the Morning Star Ranch, once a place of humming cicadas and the sweet heavy scent of alfalfa, was now a theater of vultures. Men in pinstriped suits from the city sat on folding chairs, fanning themselves with their hats, looking at the rolling hills of golden grass not as land, but as numbers on a ledger. Sarah gripped the porch railing until the splinters bit into her palms. She didn't mind the pain. It was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her, the house, the sturdy timber home her father had built with his own calloused hands, felt hollow. The windows were like empty eyes, watching as the law prepared to strip its soul away. 3,500, the auctioneer barked, his voice a rhythmic, soulless drone. I have 100 from Mr. Sterling. Do I hear 36? This is prime grazing land, gentlemen. 3,000 acres of goddess-owned country, water rights included. Silas Sterling, the local banker, with a smile as cold as a winter creek, adjusted his spectacles. He didn't even look at the land. He looked at Sarah. It was a look of predatory triumph. He didn't just want the ranch. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing the last of the Miller pride crushed under his heel. Sarah's throat was dry, clogged with the fine, alkaline dust of a 3-month drought. The Morning Star was parched, its cattle thin, its fences sagging. The bank had squeezed her, raising interest rates as the rain stopped falling, a slow-motion strangulation that had led to this afternoon in July. 3,600, a developer from Helena shouted. Sterling didn't blink. 4,000. A gasp went through the crowd of local ranchers. $4,000 was more money than any of them would see in a lifetime. It was a death sentence for Sarah's hopes. She closed her eyes, imagining her father's voice in the wind, telling her to hold on. But how do you hold on to a handful of dust when the wind is blowing a gale? 4,000 once, the auctioneer cried, pointing his mallet at Sterling. 4,000 twice. The air seemed to vanish from Sarah's lungs. She looked down at her boots, the leather worn thin, coated in the soil she was about to lose. She felt the weight of her father's pocket watch in her apron, the only thing they couldn't take. Wait. The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken with a low, gravelly resonance that cut through the auctioneer's chatter like a knife through silk. The crowd shifted, necks craned. Near the back, leaning against a weathered hitching post, stood a man who looked like he had been birthed by the trail itself. He was tall, his frame lean and hard, edged under a coat, stained by travel. A wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over his face, leaving only a rugged jawline and a dais growth of dark stubble visible. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stepping through the rows of seated city men. They recoiled slightly, as if the smell of horse sweat and wood smoke on him was an affront to their cologne. "The bid is 4,000, stranger," the auctioneer said, his voice losing some of its professional pep. "Unless you got more than that in your saddlebags, step back." The man reached the front of the crowd. He didn't look at the banker. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked up at the porch, his eyes meeting Sarah S. For a heartbeat, the chaos of the auction vanished. His eyes were the color of flint, hard gray, and carrying a depth of weariness that mirrored her own. He reached into the pocket of his duster. He didn't pull out a wad of bills or a bank draft. He pulled out a single coin. It was a large copper piece, worn smooth at the edges, gleaming dully in the harsh Montana sun. He stepped toward the auctioneer's table and placed it down with a heavy thud. 1 cent? Sterling burst out laughing, a sharp braying sound. "Is this a joke? Sheriff, remove this vagrant." The sheriff, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stepped forward. But the stranger didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for the sidearm holstered at his hip. "Check the local charter," the stranger said, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady. "Article 4 of the Homestead Grace. A forgotten statute, but a valid one in this county." The auctioneer frowned, his hand frozen over his mallet. "What are you talking about?" The stranger leaned over the table, his presence suddenly looming large. "The grace states that if a man or his kin has shed blood in defense of a property, or rendered a life-saving service to the original title holder, they hold a right of redemption. They may outbid any commercial offer with a token of honor, if the community cannot prove a greater debt is owed." He gestured to the coin. "That copper was given to my father by Sarah Miller's father on a battlefield in Virginia. It was a promise. A debt of life I'm here to collect." The yard fell into a silence, so profound you could hear the grass crackling in the heat. Sterling's face turned a violent shade of purple. "That's preposterous. That law hasn't been used since the Indian Wars. You can't possibly think a piece of scrap metal outweighs $4,000 in gold." "The law doesn't care about the weight of the metal, Mr. Sterling," the stranger replied. "It cares about the weight of the blood." The auctioneer looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the dusty law book, sitting on the edge of the table, a book he had used as a paperweight for years. With a sigh, the lawman flipped it open, his fingers fumbling through the yellowed, brittle pages. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the stranger. Who was he? He was a ghost from a war her father rarely spoke of, a man who had appeared out of the dust to stand between her and the abyss. The sheriff stopped turning pages. His eyes widened. He looked at the banker, then at the stranger, and finally at Sarah. "He's right," the sheriff whispered. "What?" Sterling screamed, standing up so fast his chair toppled over. "The statute is active." "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice gaining strength. "Under the Homestead Grace, a token of honor takes precedence over any speculative bid. Unless someone here can prove they've done more for the morning star than die for it, the ranch is sold." The auctioneer's mallet hung in the air for a long, agonizing second. He looked at the copper coin, then at the furious banker. He saw the local ranchers and the back men who had been silent all day suddenly straightening their backs. a flicker of hope igniting in their eyes. They hated Sterling. They loved the Miller family. Whack! The sound echoed off the barn. Sold, the auctioneer whispered to the man with the coin. Sarah collapsed into a chair on the porch, her legs finally giving out. The vultures began to disperse, Sterling throwing a string of curses over his shoulder as he marched toward his carriage. The yard cleared, the dust settling back onto the thirsty earth. The stranger didn't move. He stood by the table, his hand resting near the copper coin. After a moment, he picked it up and began to walk toward the porch. Sarah watched him approach. Up close, he was even more formidable. His clothes were threadbare but clean, his movements precise. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, removing his hat. His hair was dark and matted with sweat, but his face, despite the scars and the grit, held a strange, quiet dignity. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. He looked at the house, then back at her. He didn't smile. He looked like a man who had forgotten how. "My name is Caleb," he said, "and I think we've got some fences to fix." Sarah looked out at her land once more, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt the smallest, most fragile spark of peace. The drought wasn't over, and the banker wouldn't stay defeated for long. But as she looked at the stranger who had bought her life for a penny, she knew the morning star wasn't going dark just yet. But as Caleb turned to look toward the horizon, Sarah noticed the way his hand hovered near his holster, the way his eyes never stopped scanning the hills. He hadn't just brought a coin. He had brought a past, and in the West, the past usually came with a price much higher than a single cent. The sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. The auction was over, but the real struggle for the Morning Star, and for the souls of the two people now bound to it, was only just beginning. The first night of the new Morning Star was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah sat at the heavy oak kitchen table, a single oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like it was being haunted by bankers, but it felt occupied by something just as unsettling. A stranger. Outside, in the barn, Caleb was settling in. He had refused the guest room. He had refused even a meal. "The barn is fine, Miss Miller," he had said, his voice as dry as the dust on his duster. "Ma'am, used to the smell of hay and horses. It suits me better than a soft bed." Sarah looked at the deed sitting on the table. 1 copper coin. It felt like a fever dream. She ran her finger over the ink, half expecting it to vanish. Why would a man ride across the territory to save a woman he didn't know? A depth of life, he had called it. Her father had been a sergeant in the 2nd Montana Volunteers during the war. He had spoken of the mud, the cold, and the men he'd lost, but he had never mentioned a Caleb. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a question. Eventually, she stood, wrapped a wool shawl over her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The Montana sky was a cathedral of stars, indifferent to the struggles of the small creatures beneath it. The air had cooled, but the scent of parched earth remained. She looked toward the barn and saw a small orange glow, the tip of a hand-rolled cigarette. She walked down the steps, her boots crunching on the dry grass. As she approached the barn door, the glow moved. "You should be sleeping, Miss Miller." Caleb's voice came from the darkness. He was sitting on a hay bale, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight, filtering through the slats of the barn wall. "I could say the same to you," Sarah replied, leaning against the door frame. "It's been a long day." Most men would be celebrating a victory like that with a bottle of whiskey. Caleb took a slow drag, the embers illuminating the deep lines around his eyes. Victory is a loud word for a quiet night. Sterling wanted to take kindly to being humiliated by a drifter in a ghost law. He'll be back tomorrow, or the day after. I know, Silas, Sterling, Sarah said, her voice tightening. He doesn't just want the land. He wants to be right. He wants to prove that I'm a failure. You aren't a failure, Caleb said. He stood up, and even in the shadows, his presence felt massive. You were just outgunned. The world is changing, Sarah. Men like Sterling don't see soil. They see gold. They don't see history. They see obstacles. And what do you see? Caleb walked to the barn door, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. He was silent. For so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. I see a place worth defending, he finally said. My father died talking about the Morning Star. He said it was the only place he'd ever seen where the sun felt like it was actually blessing the ground instead of just burning it. I reckon I owe it to him to see if he was right. He was, Sarah whispered. They stood there for a moment, two shadows under one roof, divided by a boundary of unspoken questions. Sarah realized then that Caleb wasn't just here to work the land. He was looking for something, too, a way to settle a score with his own past. Tomorrow at dawn, Caleb said, his tone shifting back to business. We start with the fences on the North Ridge. If we can keep the cattle in, we don't to graveyard. I'll be ready, Sarah said. She turned to walk back to the house, but stopped. Caleb, thank you. For the coin. He didn't look back. He just flicked the cigarette butt into the dirt and crushed it with his heel. Don't to thank me yet, Sarah. Saving a farm is easy. Keeping it is where the blood comes in. The North Ridge was a brutal stretch of limestone and scrub brush. The fence line there had been neglected for 2 years, ever since Sarah's father had grown too weak to climb the steep terrain. The heat was already a physical weight by 9 in the morning. Sarah swung the mallet, her muscles screaming as she drove a cedar post into the stubborn, sun-baked earth. Sweat stung her eyes, and her hands, even through leather gloves, were beginning to blister. 10 yards away, Caleb worked with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. He didn't seem to tire. He moved with a rhythmic grace, his movement stripped of all wasted energy. He spoke little, only giving short directions on how to tension the wire or brace the corners. You re-holding that mallet wrong, he said, not looking up from a knot he was tying. Sarah wiped her brow, breathing hard. I've been fixing fences on this ranch since I was 10, Caleb. And you? Been wasting half your strength since you were 10, he replied. He walked over, took the mallet from her hand, and stood behind her. Don't fight the ground, let the weight of the hammer do the work. It's about the swing, not the squeeze. He placed his hands over hers on the handle. His skin was rough, like sun-cured leather, and he was warm, a steady, grounding heat. For a second, Sarah forgot the heat and the debt. She felt the callous strength of him, a man who knew the language of iron and wood. Swing from the hips, he murmured near her ear. Like this, he guided her arms in a smooth, heavy arc. The post sank deeper with half the effort. He let go immediately, stepping back into his own space. Try it, he said. She did. The rhythm was better. She looked at him, but his face was unreadable under the shadow of his hat. He wasn't being kind. He was being practical. On the Morning Star, practicality was the only currency that mattered. By noon, they paused under the meager shade of a lone cottonwood tree. Sarah pulled a canteen of lukewarm water and some dried beef from her pack. She offered some to Caleb, but he only took a sip of water. You need to eat, she said. We still have 2 miles of wire to string. Caleb looked toward the valley floor, his eyes narrowing. We have company. Sarah followed his gaze. A plume of dust was rising from the main trail. 3 riders were approaching at a gallop. Even from this distance, she recognized the lead horse, a flashy, high-stepping bay. "Sterling," she spat. Caleb stood up, his hand reflexively dropping to his belt. He didn't draw his gun, but his posture changed. The weary workman vanished, replaced by the man who had stood at the auction, the wolf among the sheep. The riders skidded to a halt at the base of the ridge. Silas. Sterling looked out of place in his fine wool suit, his face already flushed red from the heat. Beside him were 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, hired muscle with low-slung holsters and cold, empty eyes. "Found a new hobby, have we, Sarah?" Sterling called up, his voice oily. "Playing house with a vagabond?" "You read trespassing, Silas," Sarah shouted back. "The auction is over. The deed is recorded." "Oh, the deed is recorded," Sterling sneered, steering his horse closer to the slope. "But deeds are just paper, and paper burns quite easily. I'm here to offer you a graceful exit. My offer of $4,000 still stands. Take the money, leave this ruin, and let this gentleman get back to whatever trail he crawled off of." Caleb stepped forward, moving to the edge of the ridge, so he was looking down at the banker. "The lady gave you an answer," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly in the still air, "and the law gave you a receipt. You re-standing on private property. If you want to talk business, use the mail. If you want to talk trouble, keep coming up this hill." One of Sterling's men moved his hand toward his thigh. In a flash, Caleb's hand was on the grip of his Colt. He didn't pull it, but the hammer clicked a small, sharp sound that echoed like a crack of thunder. The gunman froze. He looked at Caleb's eyes and saw something that made his own bravado evaporate. This wasn't a farmer. This was a man who had killed and would do it again without blinking. "No, now," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly. "No, there's no need for theatrics. I am a man of the law." "Then follow it," Caleb said. "Turn those horses around." "Now." Sterling glared at Sarah, his eyes full of a hateful, simmering promise. "You think he can protect you forever, Sarah? The winter is coming. The bank has more than one way to break a ranch. You'll be begging me to buy this dirt by November." He yanked his horse's head around and spurted into a gallop. His men followed, leaving a trail of bitter dust in their wake. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She looked at Caleb. He was still watching the riders, his hand still on his gun. "He's right about one thing," Sarah said softly. "Winter is coming, and we be alone? Out here?" Caleb turned to her. The hardness in his face softened just a fraction, not into a smile, but into something like respect. "We aren't alone, Sarah," he said, looking at the fence they had built that morning. "We have the land, and unlike men, the land doesn't lie. Now pick up that mallet. We've still got wire to string." They worked until the sun was a bruised purple smear on the horizon. As they walked back to the house in the dying light, Sarah realized that the wolves were no longer just at the gate. They were circling. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She had a shadow of her own. Now, the storm didn't come from the sky that night. It came from the silence. After a week of grueling labor on the North Ridge, the ranch had settled into a fragile routine. Sarah handled the kitchen and the bookkeeping, which was mostly a record of what they lacked, while Caleb became a ghost in the machinery of the Morning Star. He fixed the leaking roof of the smokehouse, shored up the sagging floorboards of the porch, and spent hours in the barn, talking to the horses in a low, melodic murmur that Sarah could never quite overhear. It was Tuesday evening when Sarah decided to brave the barn. She carried a tray with a bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of sourdough bread. Caleb hadn't come in for supper again, and despite their boundary line, she couldn't let a man work 18 hours a day on an empty stomach. The barn was dim, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a rusted hook. The air smelled of sweet Timothy hay and the sharp, clean scent of neatsfoot oil. She found Caleb sitting at the back, near the tack room, cleaning a set of bridles. He didn't look up when she entered. "I told you I don't need minding, Miss Miller. And I told myself I wouldn't run a ranch where the help starves to death," Sarah countered, setting the tray down on a flat-topped grain barrel. "Eat. That's an order from the boss." Caleb paused, his cloth frozen against the leather. A small ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen. He set the bridle down and reached for the bowl. "Boss, is it? Since I'm the one paying you in hay and copper coins, yes." As Caleb ate, Sarah's eyes wandered to the corner of the tack room. A heavy, iron-bound trunk sat there, tucked under a tarp. It was old, the leather straps cracked with age, but the brass locks were polished to a shine. "What's in the box, Caleb?" she asked softly. Caleb S. Spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The air in the barn suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. "Just memories. And memories don't fix fences." "My father used to say that memories are the only things we truly own," Sarah said, stepping closer. He kept his war medals in a cigar box under his bed. He said they reminded him that he survived the worst of men so he could enjoy the best of the land. Caleb set the bowl down, his appetite gone. He looked at the trunk for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh that sounded like the wind through a canyon, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small key, and tossed it to her. "Open it," he said, his voice flat. "If you want to know who you've let onto your land, see for yourself." Sarah's hands trembled as she knelt. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic snap. Inside, nestled in velvet that had faded from crimson to a dusty rose, sat a collection of items that didn't belong to a drifter. There was a gold-tasseled epaulette from a cavalry officer, S uniform, a silver-handled hairbrush with the initials CVA engraved in flowing script, a stack of letters tied with a silk ribbon, and at the bottom, a heavy military medal, the Star of Valor. "Caleb Van Alstyne," Sarah whispered, reading the name on a folded parchment. "The Van Alstynes of Boston? The shipping magnates?" Caleb stood up and walked to the barn door, staring out at the dark mountains. "My father wanted a son who would lead fleets. I wanted a life where I didn't have to step over the bodies of the poor to get to my carriage. When the war broke out, I didn't buy my way out like my brother did. I enlisted as a scout. I saw things in the wilderness that made the ballrooms of Boston look like a fever dream." He turned back to her, his flint gray eyes burning. "I walked away from all of it. The money, the name, the legacies. Spent 10 years trying to outrun the ghost of a man who was supposed to be a king. I took my father S. dying. Wish to find the Miller Ranch as my last act of penance. I didn't come here to buy a farm, Sarah. I came here to find out if I could still be a man without a title." Sarah looked from the gold-leafed artifacts to the man in the dirty duster. She realized then that his one coin wasn't just a bid. It was his last remaining tie to a world he had rejected. "You aren't a vagabond, Caleb," Sarah said, standing up and closing the lid. "You're a man who chose his own soul over a fortune. In Montana, that makes you the richest man I know." Caleb didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, just an inch. The heat wave broke on Thursday night, with a violence that only the plains can produce. By midnight, the sky was a bruised charcoal, lit by jagged veins of violet lightning. The wind howled through the eaves of the house, rattling the windows in their frames. Sarah sat in the parlor, her heart racing. She had always hated the storms. The sound of the wind reminded her too much of the night the barn had burned 3 years ago, taking her father's last strength with it. A sudden, sharp crack louder than thunder sounded from the direction of the corral. Sarah threw on her slicker and ran outside. The rain was a solid wall of water, stinging her skin. In the flickering light of a flash, she saw the fence of the birthing pen had splintered. One of the young heifers, panicked by the thunder, had crashed through the wood and was now tangled in a mess of barbed wire and broken timber. Caleb was already there. He was drenched to the bone, his shirt clinging to his powerful frame. He was kneeling in the mud, his hands moving with agonizing slowness near the heifer's trapped leg. "Don't come closer, Sarah," he shouted over the roar of the rain. She spooked. "If she kicks, she'll break her leg or your ribs." "I can hold her head," Sarah cried, dropping into the muck beside him. She grabbed the heiferess halter, pulling the animal's head into her lap. The cow was bawling, its eyes rolling in terror. Sarah began to hum a low, rhythmic tune her father used to sing. She didn't realize she was crying until the salt hit her lips. For an hour, they worked in the mud and the dark. Caleb's hands were sliced by the wire, blood mixing with the rainwater, but he didn't stop. He spoke to the animal and to Sarah in a voice so calm it seemed to create a pocket of peace in the center of the storm. "Steady now," he murmured. "Almost there, little one. Just a bit more." With a final metallic snip, the last wire gave way. Caleb gently eased the heifer's leg free. The animal lay there for a second, exhausted, before scrambling to its feet and trotting back toward the shelter of the barn. Caleb slumped back into the mud, his chest heaving. Sarah sat beside him, the rain soaking through her clothes, her adrenaline fading into a deep, hollow ache. "Your hands," she said, reaching for him. "Caleb, you're bleeding." "It's just skin," he grunted, but he didn't pull away when she took his hand. In the dim light of the back porch lamp, Sarah saw the jagged cuts across his palms. She led him into the kitchen, the warmth of the wood stove feeling like a miracle. She made him sit by the fire while she fetched a basin of warm water, clean rags, and a bottle of medicinal whiskey. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. As Sarah cleaned his wounds, she felt a shift in the air. The boundary line was gone, washed away by the mud of the corral. "Why do you stay?" she asked quietly, her head bowed over his hand. "You have the Star of Valor. You have a family in Boston. You could be anywhere but here, fighting for a dry patch of dirt and a woman who can't even pay you." Caleb watched her, the firelight dancing in the gray of his eyes. "I spent 4 years in a war where I saw men die for nothing. For lines on a map drawn by men in velvet chairs. Then I spent 6 years drifting, looking for a reason to wake up the next morning." He reached out his other hand, his fingers grazing the side of her face, brushing away a stray, wet lock of hair. His touch was hesitant, as if he were afraid he might break her. "I stayed because for the first time in 10 years, I found someone who fights for something real," he whispered. "You don't fight for a map, Sarah. You fight for a home. And I think I've forgotten what that feels like." Sarah looked up, her breath catching. The distance between them vanished. In the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of rain and cedar smoke, Caleb leaned in. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but a kiss of recognition. It was the taste of shared salt and shared burdens. It was the moment two broken things realized they might just fit together. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the Morning Star, the healing had finally begun. Sarah realized that the one coin hadn't just bought her ranch. It had bought her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a partner who wasn't afraid of the dark. The peace of the Morning Star was shattered not by a storm of nature, but by a storm of ink and ego. 3 days after the storm, the heat returned with a vengeance, but it was accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of a carriage. Sarah stood on the porch, drying her hands on her apron, as the black-lacquered buggy of Silas Sterling pulled into the yard. This time he wasn't alone with hired guns. He brought a man in a stiff collar, a circuit lawyer, and the sheriff, who looked like he had aged 10 years since the auction. Miss Miller, the lawyer began, unfolding a heavy parchment with a seal that looked far too official. I am Horace Thorne, representing the First Territorial Bank. We are here to serve a formal notice of seizure and vacancy. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The auction was settled. The sheriff himself oversaw it. The lawyer sneered, his spectacles glinting. The auction was an anomaly. A token of honor is a subjective, archaic concept that holds no standing in modern commerce. We have filed an injunction stating that the bid of $4,000 was the only legitimate currency offered. Your guest essentially stole this property with a piece of scrap metal. Caleb emerged from the barn, his duster coated in the dust of the corral. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, terrifying confidence of a man who knew exactly where the landmines were buried. The law doesn't become archaic just because it's inconvenient for your ledger. Counselor Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. We'll see about that, Sterling barked from the buggy. Sheriff, do your duty. Remove them. The sheriff hesitated, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. Silas, the law book says. The law book is wrong, Sterling screamed. Caleb stepped into the center of the yard, his flint gray eyes fixed on the banker. You want to talk about the law, Sterling? Let's talk about the Homestead Reversion Act of 1872. Section 8. It states that any bank-seizing property must prove that the original debt was not artificially inflated through predatory interest adjustments during times of natural disaster. The lawyer's face went pale. That has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with it, Caleb interrupted. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. I spent yesterday in the county archives while Sarah was checking the fences. I found your records, Sterling. You've been raising interest rates on every ranch in this valley the moment the rain stopped falling. That S, not banking, that is racketeering. Sarah looked at Caleb in shock. She hadn't even realized he had left the property. You have no proof of that in a court of law, Thorne stammered. I have the signatures of 15 ranchers in this valley who were squeezed just like Sarah, Caleb said, tapping the ledger. And I have the Star of Valor in my trunk. If this goes to a territorial judge, I'll make sure the headlines in Helena read, Banker steals land from war heroes. How do you think your investors in Chicago will feel about that? The silence that followed was heavy. The sheriff actually let out a small, muffled snort of satisfaction. Sterling's hands were shaking on the reins. He knew he was beaten, not by a gun, but by a man who understood the system better than he did.
This isn't over, Miller.
Sterling hissed, his eyes darting to Sarah. You were living on borrowed time? No, Sarah said, her voice finally finding its strength. I'm living on the Morning Star. Now get off my land before I let my foreman show you how we handle trash. As the carriage peeled away, the dust settling behind it, Caleb didn't celebrate. He just looked down at the ledger. He'll go to the territorial capital now, Caleb said quietly. He'll try to buy a judge. We won a battle, Sarah, but the war is moving to higher ground. Sarah walked down the steps and stood beside him.
How did you know where to look?
Caleb looked at her, his expression softening. Men like Sterling always leave a paper trail. They think the poor are too tired to read. They usually write. But I've had a lot of time to read in the dark. Victory brought a strange, nervous energy to the ranch. With the immediate threat of eviction stalled, the focus shifted from survival to revival. The following Sunday, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah decided to host a Harvest Hope dinner. It wasn't a true harvest. The crops were still struggling, but the garden Caleb had helped her irrigate was finally producing greens and hardy tubers. We shouldn't be wasting the kerosene, Caleb remarked as he saw her polishing the good glass lamps. It's not a waste if it reminds us why we working, Sarah countered. I invited the Thompsons and the O'Malleys. They lost their land last month. They were living in tents by the river. Caleb paused, a pitchfork in his hand. You re-inviting the people? Sterling broke? If we have a roof and they don't, then our roof is too big, she said firmly. When the neighbors arrived, they looked like ghosts. Their clothes were ragged, their faces etched with the hollow exhaustion of people who had been told they were worthless by the world. They sat at the long oak table, their eyes darting to Caleb, the one-coin cowboy they had heard so many rumors about. The dinner was simple: roast potatoes, salt pork, and bread. But as the meal progressed, the air in the room changed. I heard what you did at the auction, old man, Thompson said, his voice trembling. Saved her with a penny. I wish I'd had a penny like that when they took my spread. Caleb sat at the end of the table, his usual silence acting as a steadying force. It wasn't the penny that saved the ranch, Mr. Thompson. It was the law. And the law belongs to you as much as it belongs to the man in the suit. Sarah watched as Caleb spent the evening not talking about himself, but asking Thompson about his cattle breeding techniques. He asked the O'Malley boys about the best places to find wild clover. He treated them not as refugees, but as experts, as men of dignity. Slowly, the hollow looks vanished. Laughter, brittle at first, began to fill the room. We were going to form a grange, Sarah announced, her heart swelling as she looked around the table. A collective. We'll share the Morning Star's equipment. We'll pool our seed. If Sterling tries to take one of us, he has to take all of us. The men looked at each other. For the first time in years, they didn't look like they were waiting for a blow. They looked like they were ready to stand up. After the guests had left, Sarah and Caleb stood together by the sink, washing the heavy ceramic plates. The house felt warm, humming with the residual energy of the people who had occupied it. A dangerous woman, Sarah Miller, Caleb said, his voice playful for the first time. Why ask that? You were giving people ideas. Ideas like equality. Ideas like standing together. The men in the city, they don't like ideas like that. It makes the land harder to steal. Good, she said, her hand brushing against his in the soapy water. She didn't pull away. Let them come. I'm not just fighting for my father anymore. I'm fighting for the valley. Caleb turned to her, his face inches from hers. The fire in the stove had died down to embers, leaving them in a soft, amber glow. I spent my life thinking the only way to be free was to be alone, he whispered. But tonight, seeing them, I think I was wrong. Freedom isn't being alone. Freedom is having something worth sharing. He leaned in, and this time, the kiss was deeper. It was a promise of a future that went beyond deeds and copper coins. It was a promise of a home that was being built, brick by brick, soul by soul. But as they stood in each other's arms, the wind picked up outside, whistling through the eaves. It was a cold wind, a herald of the Montana winter. And they both knew that while the table was full tonight, the hardest months were still ahead. The seeds of community had been planted, but the frost was coming. And Silas Sterling was not a man who let seeds grow. The Montana winter didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a roar. By mid-November, the vibrant gold of the valley had been buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The Morning Star was no longer a ranch. It was an island in a frozen sea. Inside the house, the air smelled of cedar smoke and dried herbs. Sarah sat by the hearth, mending a pair of Caleb S. work trousers. The silence between them had become a comfortable thing, a shared language of presence. But that silence was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by the sound of bells, heavy, expensive bells, that didn't belong to a rancher's sleigh. A massive velvet-lined cutter pulled into the yard, drawn by two black stallions that looked like they had been plucked from a New York carriage house. Out stepped a man who looked like a sharper, colder version of Caleb. He wore a coat of polished wolf fur and leather boots that had never stepped in manure. Caleb, who had been sharpening an axe on the porch, stood up slowly, his face turned to stone. "Julian," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Caleb," the man replied, stepping onto the porch and looking around with an expression of thinly veiled disgust. "I see. You have traded the family crest for a pile of frozen dirt." Mother is distraught, though I suspect she says mostly embarrassed. Sarah stepped onto the porch, her heart tightening. She knew instinctively who this was. Julian Van Alstyne, the legacy Caleb had tried to bury. "Miss Miller, I presume," Julian said, offering a stiff, rehearsed bow. "I am here to rectify a family tragedy. My brother has played the martyr long enough. I have the papers and the funds to settle all debts associated with this establishment, provided Caleb returns with me to Boston to settle the estate. Our Father S. will is being contested, and we need the Star of Valor recipient to maintain our standing." The kitchen table, once a place of healing, became a battlefield. Julian sat there, sipping tea Sarah had made, while he laid out a map of a world Sarah could barely imagine. He spoke of shipping lanes, dividends, and brownstone houses. He offered Sarah a check that would not only pay off Sterling, but buy her 3 more ranches in the valley. "All you have to do," Miss Miller, Julian said, sliding a gold fountain pen across the table, "is release my brother from whatever token of honor, nonsense you've used to tether him here. Let him return to a life that befits a Van Alstyne." Sarah looked at the check. It was a king ransom. It was the end of all her fears. Then she looked at Caleb, who was standing by the window, his back to the room. "Caleb is a free man, Mr. Van Alstyne," Sarah said, her voice trembling but clear. "He isn't tethered by a coin or a law. He is here because he chose to be." Julian laughed, a dry, metallic sound. "He is here because he is hiding. But you can't hide in a blizzard forever. Caleb, be reasonable. You re a soldier and a scholar. You re-wasting your life fixing fences for a woman who will be bankrupt by spring, regardless of what I do." Caleb turned around. The flint gray in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary, ancient sadness. "You never understood the Star of Valor, Julian. You think it's a decoration for the parlor. It was given to me because I stayed behind when everyone else ran. I am not running now. It's $4,000, Caleb." Julian snapped, pointing at the check. You re-choosing a life of frostbite and poverty over your own blood. The tension in the room was suffocating. Sarah felt a wave of terror. If Caleb stayed, he was choosing a life of hardship. If he left, he would be safe, wealthy, and miserable. She realized that loving him meant she couldn't ask him to stay. Caleb, Sarah said softly, standing up. She reached into her apron and pulled out the worn copper coin, the one he had placed on the auction table months ago. She walked over and pressed it into his hand. You've paid your debt, she whispered, her eyes stinging. The Morning Star is healthy again, because of you. If you stay because you feel you owe me, then I know better than Silas Sterling. You re-free. Go to Boston. Be the man your father wanted you to be, if that S where your heart is. Caleb looked down at the coin in his palm. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Julian smiled, reaching for his fur coat. Wise woman. Pack your things, Caleb. The train leaves from the junction at dawn. Caleb looked at Sarah. He saw the strength in her jaw and the heartbreak in her eyes. He saw a woman who was willing to lose her world just to ensure he was truly free. You rewrite, Julian, Caleb said, his voice low. I am choosing blood, but not the blood in our veins. He walked to the table, picked up the gold fountain pen, and instead of signing the papers, he wrote 3 words across the back of the check. Not for sale. Get out, Julian, Caleb said, and take your stallions with you. They aren't built for Montana winters. Neither are you. Julian S. face twisted into a mask of rage. You will rot here, Caleb. When the bank takes this place and she's out in the snow, don't look for me. I stopped looking for you in '64. Brother, Caleb replied. As the cutter roared out of the yard, the bells fading into the muffled silence of the snow, Sarah stood frozen by the table. Caleb walked over to her. He took a copper coin and placed it back on the mantelpiece, right next to her father's pocket watch. Why? She asked, a single tear finally escaping. You could have had everything. Caleb pulled her into his arms, his wool coat smelling of cold air and pine. He tucked his chin over her head, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. I do have everything, Sarah, he whispered. I spent 30 years being a Van Alstyne. I think I'd like to spend the rest of my life just being the man who bought a farm for a penny. In the heart of the Montana winter, the house on the Morning Star was the only warm place for 50 miles. Caleb hadn't just rejected a fortune. He had claimed his liberty, and for Sarah, the greatest gift wasn't the ranch being saved. It was knowing that the man standing beside her wasn't there out of duty, but out of a freedom that only the heart can understand. They stood by the window, watching the snowfall, 2 souls who had outbid the world with nothing but a single coin and a refusal to be broken. The departure of Julian Van Alstyne had left a lingering chill in the house, a reminder that the world outside was still hungry and cold. But Caleb had made his choice, and for a few weeks, the Morning Star felt like a fortress of quiet defiance. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't from Julian, but from a legal firm in Helena. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed as he read the heavy parchment. Sarah watched him from the stove, her heart hammering. Is it Sterling? Has he found another loophole? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He stood up, grabbed his hat, and walked to the window. I have to go to the city, Sarah. Just for a few days. There are things that need to be finalized. Caleb, the mountain passes are treacherous this time of year, she warned, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. What is so important that it can't wait until spring? Trust me, was all he said. He left at dawn the next morning. Sarah watched from the porch as his silhouette disappeared into the gray-white mist of the valley. She felt a hollow ache she hadn't felt since her father died. She had given him the coin. She had told him he was free. Now she had to live with the possibility that freedom meant he might never come back. The days that followed were the loneliest of her life. She ran the ranch with a grim, mechanical determination. She hauled water through the snow, fed the cattle, and spent her nights staring at the copper coin on the mantelpiece. While she worked, she noticed something strange. The neighbors, the Thompsons, the O'Malleys, and others who had attended their dinner began to show up. They didn't come to borrow, they came to give. Thompson brought a sack of grain. O'Malley spent a day repairing the hinges on the heavy barn door. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked O'Malley as he wiped grease from his hands. "Because of what that man said," O'Malley replied, looking toward the trail Caleb had taken. "He told us the law belongs to us. He told us we weren't just beggars. We're keeping this place standing because it's the only place in the valley where a man can still hold his head high." Sarah realized then that Caleb's influence had gone deeper than just fixing fences. He had restored their dignity. In Helena, Caleb wasn't fighting for his family's fortune. He was in a cramped, mahogany-walled office, facing a panel of trustees. "You realize what you are asking, Mr. Van Alstyne?" the head trustee asked, peering over his spectacles. "To liquidate your entire personal trust, a sum that could sustain you for 3 lifetimes, to create a land grant endowment for a group of bankrupt farmers in a Montana valley? It's madness." "It's not madness," Caleb replied, his voice steady and iron-hard. "It's an investment in something that actually grows. My family made their money on the sea, but the sea doesn't have a soul. This land does. I want every title Sterling sees to be bought back. I want them placed in a permanent trust governed by the people who work them. And what will be left for you?" Caleb reached into his pocket and felt the phantom weight of the copper coin he had left behind. "I've already got everything I need." The process took longer than expected. Paperwork, signatures, and the slow grind of bureaucracy. By the time Caleb rode back into the valley, the first thaw had begun. The snow was turning to slush, and the smell of wet earth, the smell of hope, was rising from the ground. When Sarah saw him cresting the hill, she didn't wait. She ran out into the mud, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Caleb dismounted, his horse steaming in the cold air, and caught her in his arms. "You're back," she sobbed into his chest. "I told you," he whispered. "I am the foreman of the Morning Star. I can't leave the boss alone during the thaw." He handed her a thick envelope. Inside were the deeds for the Thompson and O'Malley farms, stamped with the seal of the Morning Star Sanctuary Trust. "I didn't go to get my life back, Sarah," he said, holding her face in his calloused hands. "I went to give theirs back." The one-coin cowboy had done the impossible. He had taken the wealth of the city and used it to fortify the spirit of the West. Spring in Montana is a miracle. The valley transformed from a white desert into a sea of emerald green and wild lupine. The creeks were swollen with snowmelt, singing as they rushed toward the Missouri. For the Morning Star, it was a season of new beginnings. Under the trust Caleb had established, the farmers of the valley were no longer subjects of the bank. They were partners. They worked together, sharing equipment and labor, creating a wall of community that Silas Sterling could no longer penetrate. The banker had eventually moved on to easier prey in the South, driven out by a town that had finally learned how to say no. On a warm Saturday in June, the ranch was busier than it had ever been. People from all over the county had gathered under the great cottonwood trees. There was fiddle music, the smell of pit-roasted beef, and the sound of children laughing, a sound that had been absent from the Morning Star for too long. Sarah stood on the porch, wearing a dress of simple blue cotton. She looked at the crowd and then at the man standing beside her. Caleb had traded his dusty duster for a clean white shirt, though he still wore his worn leather boots. "Look at them," Sarah whispered. "They're happy, Caleb, truly happy. They're free, Sarah," Caleb corrected gently. "There's a difference." The Reverend stepped forward, and the crowd went silent. It wasn't a grand wedding. There were no cathedrals or velvet pews. There was just the open sky, the scent of pine, and the witnesses who had seen them struggle through the dark. When it came time for the rings, Caleb hesitated. He didn't have a band of gold or a diamond from Boston. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 items. He had taken the original copper coin and a second one he had found in his father's old trunk. He had spent the long winter nights in the barn, using his scout tools to hammer and heat the copper, shaping them into 2 simple, glowing bands. "I bought this ranch with 1 coin," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the quiet yard. "And I bought my soul back with the other." "Sarah, I don't have a fortune to give you. I only have my hands, my word, and these pieces of copper that have seen us through the storm." Sarah took his hand, her eyes overflowing with tears of joy. "Caleb, you gave me back my home. You gave me back my faith. A gold ring would be too light for a love like ours. This copper, it has the weight of the earth in it." As they exchanged the rings, the sun began to set, casting a golden amber glow over the entire valley. It was the morning star light her father had loved so much. The celebration lasted long into the night, but eventually the guests departed, their wagons disappearing into the starlight. Sarah and Caleb sat on the porch steps, the silence of the ranch now a warm, living thing. "What now, Mr. Van Alstyne?" Sarah asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Caleb looked out at the rolling hills, at the cattle grazing peacefully, and at the lights of the neighboring farms twinkling in the distance. He looked at the copper ring on his finger, a symbol of a debt finally, beautifully paid. "Now," Caleb said, pulling her closer, "we live. We plant the seeds, we fix the fences, and we make sure that one day, when we re-gone, the people who stand on this porch know that this land wasn't bought with gold." Sarah smiled, closing her eyes. "No, it was bought with a coin, a heart, and a promise." The 1-coin cowboy and the Morning Star bride sat together as the moon rose over Montana. The drought was a memory, the banker was a ghost, and the land, their land, was finally at peace. They had outbid the world, and in doing so, they had found the only thing that truly lasts: the quiet, stubborn power of love and the dignity of a place to call home. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
In the vast, untamed stretches of the American West, we often say that gold is the only thing that talks. We're taught to believe that power belongs to the man with the loudest voice or the heaviest purse. But as we look back at the story of Sarah Miller and the stranger named Caleb, we find a truth that's much older than the hills of Montana. The auction at the Morning Star wasn't just a battle over acreage and water rights. It was a trial of the human soul. When Silas Sterling stood there with his thousands of dollars, he represented a world that knows the price of everything, but the value of nothing. He saw a failing ranch. He saw a desperate woman. He saw an opportunity for profit. But when Caleb placed that single worn copper coin on the table, he changed the currency of the conversation. You see, that coin wasn't just metal. It was a token of honor. It represented a debt of life, a promise kept across decades, and the belief that sacrifice carries more weight than speculation. The first great lesson of this story is that integrity is a legacy. What we do today, the kindness we show, the lives we save creates a ripple that can reach out across the years to save our children when they have nothing else left to hold on to. But the story didn't end at the auction. The true healing began in the quiet moments, fixing fences in the heat, standing together in the mud of a midnight storm, and opening a door to neighbors who had been broken by the same system. We learned that dignity is not something you possess. It's something you grant to others. By treating his broken neighbors as experts and equals, Caleb didn't just give them charity. He gave them back their spirits. The morning star reminds us that human connection is the ultimate irrigation. Just as a parched field needs water to bloom, a wounded heart needs the steady presence of someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Sarah and Caleb didn't save the ranch because they were perfect. They saved it because they were willing to be vulnerable. They showed us that individual liberty isn't the freedom to be alone. It's the freedom to choose who you stand with. As we leave the Valley of the Morning Star, let's carry this lesson in our pockets. Never underestimate the power of a single coin, a single word of encouragement, a single act of selfless courage, or a single moment of standing your ground against injustice can outbid all the greed in the world. In a world that tells you to keep climbing over others to reach the top, remember the man who walked away from a fortune to find his soul in the dirt of a struggling farm. Because in the end, we don't take our bank accounts to the grave. We only take the love we gave away and the homes we built in the hearts of others. Keep the fire burning, and remember, the sun always rises on a heart that knows its true home.